Barrie and Carleton in this light is that these are the type of people that, you know, I talked about stock before. This is the type of people that we have here now. We have Carleton who's here, and he realizes the employment opportunities aren't in his hometown, and he's here now making his life here. And he's, like his dad, is willing to give because he's working in this caring job. This job that have, you know, seen people less fortunate in some ways than him to find themselves needing some extra care. Care that you know, that it takes, I believe, Mr. Speaker, a special person to give. And Carleton has answered the bell on this column, Mr. Speaker. But what I'm afraid of, his government hasn't. His government hasn't answered the bell for him when it comes to a fair wage. That they can't come and see that, you know, these people aren't looking to break the bank, Mr. Speaker. They're looking for a fair wage. They're looking, you know, do you think, I wouldn't even say do you think, I know, Mr. Speaker, there's not one person that have withdrawn their labor services wouldn't go back tomorrow if the government would just say, look, we're willing to negotiate. We know who we are. We know we're the ghost at the table, and we're the only ones that can rectify this problem. If they took that compassion that Carleton's dad exhibited in New Waterford many years ago, when he took basically an unknown, there was not too many recreation directors from Cape North to Yarmouth in this province. There may have been a handful at that time, Mr. Speaker. There was very few of them, but he basically said, look, I'm going to show leadership. I'm going to show what this is all about. I'm going to show you what community need is, and the only way I could do that is rolling up my sleeves and getting involved and doing it. Not talking about doing it, not showing somebody how to do it, but doing it hands-on. And that's the challenge to this government, is show the compassion and show the respect that Carleton's dad gave his community, and by virtue of giving it to the community, gave it to this province. And I believe that's what this government has to do. It owes people like Carleton's dad to do those type of things, Mr. Speaker. Now, a third young man from my constituency I want to talk about is a young fellow named Danny Romard. Now, Danny, like the previous two gentlemen I talked about, is here for various reasons, and not the least of which is the economic opportunity that the metro area provides a young man in his late 20s, early 30s for employment as it does back home, Mr. Speaker. But, you know, Danny's dad is still alive, and Danny's dad's name is Charles Romard. But Charles doesn't go by Charles. No? He got a nickname. What is it? And his nickname is Ripper.
Ripper?
Ripper.
I heard you on the phone the other day.
Yeah, and I've known Ripper, God, I must be, Nanky's my nickname. The finance minister wants to know my nickname is Nanky, but it's not Ripper. So Ripper I've known, and Ripper is your quintessential Cape Breton character, okay? He loves life. He lives it to the fullest. It may be sometimes a bit too full, but he loves it. Full in the way he experiences all of life's experience, Mr. Speaker. Ripper is a coal miner. He's a cancer survivor. His wife died relatively young from ALS. He was left to raise his family, you know, with the assistance of some, you know, as it is. I think I look at the Minister of Tourism, he'll know this, typical thing of the older kids looking after the younger kids, because there was quite a spectrum when Mary passed away. And Ripper, but Ripper's the type of guy, you know, he loves a good time. He loves his family and he loves his community, Mr. Speaker, and he'd tell you himself, if he was here, that if he ever hurt anybody, it was only himself. And it was, well, he probably hurt some other people because he's a pretty darn good boxer in his day. So that, and I believe that's where he got his nickname at. But nonetheless, it was never like a guy that would go out. He was the type of neighbor everyone would like to have next door, because if there was something on his plate and there was nothing on yours, his play to be at your house, Mr. Speaker. That's the way it is. And while I like to say that says a lot about New Waterford, I think that says a lot about Nova Scotians, because I think I can go into your community and you can show me examples of that. So it's not, it's not one where I'm trying to bolster one area over another. It's just, I think it's just go back to the idea of stock and what it's all about, Mr. Speaker, and what these people mean. But what I want to do is, again, draw the example of what that's about. That's about a fella that, kind of different than the other two gentlemen I spoke about earlier, of giving to your community, and it's being there and saying, I'm responsible. And this is what the government should be doing in its Financial Measures Act, is saying, I'm responsible fiscally for what's going on in this province, as much as Ripper Romard is in his way, or Otto White when he was alive, or Gary McDonald when Gary was alive. All these things, Speaker, and that's there is a real, I am my brother's keeper, but yet I think the government has missed this. I think if Ripper was here today, he'd tell you that. He'd say, look, you're wrong. It's all about being fair. You have choices. It's about being fair. I don't want my. I'm sure today, if he had Danny home with him, he'd be much happier. But he also knows that that's the reality of Danny probably couldn't make a good wage at home if he could find a job at home. So, he's already asked to pay one side of this province's debt, and that's to have his son leave his home, Mr. Speaker, because I think we all aspire to have our children around us and to be able to enjoy our own time with their family. But Ripper's willing to look the other side. But he's saying to this province today that why isn't my son, for all the hard work he's done, for all I've given to this personally in my work life, in my personal life through being a cancer survivor, to an early death of his wife through ALS. One of his daughters died very suddenly, Mr. Speaker. It's a hard life. He's lived a hard life, but a full, fun life, all the same. He's not complaining, but he's asking his government to treat us fairly. We're as equal here as we are anywhere. And my son Danny, I bet you he's saying, my son Danny deserves this, because I know what he's like. He's a hard worker, and his first priority is not his wage envelope, Mr. Speaker. It's the care of the residents at our RSS. So, Speaker, that's why we're here today, and we're talking about Bill 36. I give you 3 lives, if you will, 3 families, how it's affected and how they've come to the table differently. Now, I suppose some people could go and critique this and say, well, it really, what impact, what correlation does this have to the Financial Measures Act? But what I would say to caring people, they would understand that it's all about, if we don't have compassion in legislation, and some could say you can't have compassion and financial responsibility on the same table. I disagree, because if you can't have it together, then it's a cold, heartless government, no matter what stripe it is. So for those who say you can't have both, I say you're wrong, and I pity where you're going with your life, because it is important that the two of them, and it's a necessity that the two of them are put together, Mr. Speaker. So we have those 3 little stories, Mr. Speaker. So I want to lay that out to you and hope that kind of seeps through to the government. Now I'm going to change just a bit here, Speaker, because I want to now talk about, not so much just the straight labor issues around Financial Measures Act and the compassion and the leadership the government should show. But I want to talk about it's the idea of the bill as it respects casinos and smoking, in particular casinos, Mr. Speaker, because I don't think, the government can say that all they want, that this is an enabling legislation. And I don't disagree with them one iota when they say they're working in the confines of a bad deal. I don't disagree at all. They're absolutely right. I just cannot believe that you would sell the farm like this, Mr. Speaker, in a deal. You know, I could not imagine ever trying to negotiate a deal when you handcuff not only your own government, but governments clear onto the foreseeable future. Why would a government do that? The only thought could be that it was a mean-spirited government that said, look, if we can't have it, nobody's going to have it. And so invariably they chop the deal in such a way that people cannot afford to get out of it. And, you know, there's a part of me sympathizes with this government on that, Mr. Speaker. But with that said, is that they're using the proverbial mall hammer to kill an ant here. You know, you sit down, and I guess it flows with the RRSS strike because their failure to negotiate. They want to take this unusual step of bringing in this piece of legislation that would override a lot of good details in various bylaws, whether it's CBRM or HRM, respecting workplace safety. You know, this is North American Occupational Safety and Health Week, Mr. Speaker. As we said earlier, we all look, I don't want to hold us up because it'd be considered a prop, but we were all given on our desks today, we were given tabloid newspaper-style brochures on it being North America Occupational Safety and Health Week. And the government quite, I would say boldly hands these out without a thought of what they're doing in the workplace to workers in casinos. Now, we can say all we want and say that this is enabling legislation, and that if they're not going to abide by the municipal bylaws, then we're going to yank them in and get the process going. Well, it's still like I'm sure the Premier knows very well that you're playing Russian roulette very literally with people's health there. I mean, some people, I'm sure in the Premier's previous lifestyle, people that smoked nearly all their lives and was not really bothered, wasn't really bothered with either smoking or secondhand smoke. Other people exposed to it for a very short while, and to disastrous consequences, Mr. Speaker. So we can't say, well, look, we'll let you as a worker be exposed to it for a determinate amount of time until we get this straightened out. I think the more prudent thing would have been to say, look, well, let's start letting, if the casinos want to put us on notice, well, let's start talking now about some sort of negotiation around, and keeping in mind that we're not going to reduce the bylaws around smoking in the public places, either in CBRM or HRM. Because, if we remember, when this legislation, when the smoke-free places legislation came forward, there was never any talk of this, Mr. Speaker. There was the matter of fact, the big discussion from this government was the ability that it gave municipalities to go further with their own bylaws. It wasn't talking about taking anything back. Its talk was about taking that the municipalities wouldn't be encumbered by any provincial statutes, that they were certainly free to go out and make it even tougher, and with the government's blessing. That's what I was led to believe. I mean, I sat in on law amendments, and I heard various speakers go on and worried about it. And, it seems that this government has kind of just said, well, that was then, this is now. It's not working. So let's now look at what the government is doing also by way of saying, look, we're going to enable the casinos to allow smoking in areas. What type of level playing field is that? We again, and I'll go back to my experience in law amendments, we had very many bar operators come in here, particularly during a bill around the Smokes-Free Places Act and talked to us about, well, you know, all I want it to be is, I may not agree with it, and I think it will hurt my business, but I want it to be fair, and I want it to be the same in Wolfville as it is in Yarmouth, as it is in Halifax, as it is in Sydney, as it is in Ingonish. But now the government assured them that that could be done, but now it's taking a different tack. It's not where I think the bar owners thought when this bill was first presented would be that they would ramp it up more. Actually, what they're doing is pulling it back from one group and allowing groups to have a special circumstance. So for those people who, for whatever reason, do their gambling in bars and for whatever reason continue to smoke, now have basically been told you can now keep doing that, but you have to do it at the casino. So what you're literally doing is chasing business out of a lot of these smaller bars. So why wouldn't the government come in and negotiate? Well, Mr. Speaker, I think it's quite, I think, a very simple question to answer, in that it looked at its track record around banging out deals with private corporations, whether it's Orenda, whether it's Michelin, whomever, that they never come out on the good end. Nova Scotians don't do anyway, on the good end of banging out deals as it reflects to these measures. Now, last week, Andrea Skinner took this fight to another level. She took it to the Board of Referees at UI, and she won her appeal. So now EI has basically, at that level, made the decree that it's considered those sites as an unhealthy work site. They're allowing you, for purposes of drawing EI, to say this. Now, as someone who's had some experience, not as much as some other members of this House, but have had some experience around EI appeals, we also know that that could be appealed to a further level, which is the umpire's decision, and then on to a ministerial appeal or a Supreme Court appeal. And so that may be in the offing, but nonetheless, as of today, the ruling stands that Andrea Skinner has been allowed to draw her EI as it relates to her employment time at Casino Nova Scotia, and that she will also be considered there for her reason for leaving was a valid one because it was related to her health and safety. So where does that leave this government now, when other members, if for instance, if tomorrow, if 10 people quit Casino Nova Scotia, what happens? You know, and what we have actually there is a real problem for the casino. Then you end up with a shortage of workers, people not wanting to work there because they don't want to be forced to inhale secondhand smoke, Mr. Premier. So these are topics I think this government should look long and hard at. That there has to be another method of getting a deal out of the casino operators. We don't need to compound a bad Liberal deal with a bad piece of Tory legislation. I asked the Premier and the Finance Minister to rise above that, to do what's right for the workers in Nova Scotia. Give them the protection that they deserve. Don't capitulate, don't give in to some kind of higher threat from the casino operators that say, if you don't do this, we're going to saddle you with $110 million. I don't think that they're going to do that. They're not here for, pardon the pun, their good health. They're here to make money in Nova Scotia. And I don't think in any way, shape, or form their business is encumbered any more than any other establishment in this province that also sells alcohol and have gaming machines. So therefore, they shouldn't be given any more protection than these people. Don't forget, you know, that the people that own, and I'm not doing the bidding for these people in any way, shape, or form, but these people that own those other places are Nova Scotians. They live in Nova Scotia. They hire Nova Scotians. They pay Nova Scotian taxes. Their corporate headquarters, if they're incorporated, are here in Nova Scotia. Unlike the casinos, who are an international corporation, who have no allegiance to this province, that could just as well close shop and go to Biloxi, Mississippi, go somewhere offshore. They're of no value, you know. They just as soon slough off Nova Scotian. They have no ties to Nova Scotian. Not like the hundreds of bar owners here that have built their businesses over the years, have seen the changes, have kept up with them, and have been willing, maybe not always agree with government, but to work with government to make, you know, their business grow, that they would make a profit, that by making a profit they could hire people and employ these people, and these people would therefore put their money back in the economy. This isn't offshore money. These folks, with a lot of these people own, well, it could probably, if it could be rightfully described as mom and pop operations that hire, that by and large employ anybody in probably outside the metro area, 8 to 10 people on a full-time, part-time basis, that provide these real, like, more rural type areas with much needed jobs. Yet we're turning our backs on them, but saying, no, the big international company that run Casino Nova Scotia, that you're an exempt because you were given a favor by the former administration, and we're beholding to that. As opposed to sitting down with those people and saying this is not right, and we're not going to impact two wrongs don't make a right, Mr. Premier. So there's nothing in this Financial Measures Act that would help those bar owners. Matter of fact, there's only stuff in here that would hurt those people. So we want, I think, this government to realize that there's Nova Scotians out there that really don't see this government as being responsive to them. There are Nova Scotians out there that see that this government is working away from them and not towards them, Mr. Speaker. We see a government that in the very near future will be asking Nova Scotians, well, what do you think of us, by way of a general election? And if these are the type of answers, if these are the type of questions being posed to Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, well, I would think there's going to be a resounding negative vote to this government, Mr. Speaker, because they're not here asking and answering the type of questions that my Nova Scotia represents. My Nova Scotia wants fairness. It wants fairness for workers all across this province, Mr. Speaker. It wants a province that represents them. And in closing, Mr. Speaker, I want to tell you, I think we want a Nova Scotia like the one I talked about, that Craig Martell's grandfather Otto White worked for, that Carl MacDonald's father Gary worked for, that Danny Romar's father Charles Ripper Romard worked for, is one of fairness, compassion, honesty, and hard work, and a balance for everyone, and that people are looked after, whoever they work for, and that they're rewarded financially, and so on, Mr. Speaker. I thank you.
Thank you. Good job, Nick.
Thank you. I recognize the member from Glace Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to, just before I get into debating the actual bill itself, Bill 36, I wanted to comment on a few of the comments that my colleague from Cape Breton Centre made today. In particular, in this case they were wise comments, in particular about the people that he was talking about that are here from Cape Breton and even more so from New Waterford. And I wanted to say, although not knowing all of the people that the member for Cape Breton Centre talked about, I did have the pleasure of knowing Gary MacDonald, who was perhaps, and I say this with all honesty, one of the finest individuals I've ever had the pleasure of knowing, Mr. Speaker. And to this very day, if you want to get a picture of something comical, then picture, you didn't know Gary MacDonald, Mr. Speaker, but as the member for Cape Breton Centre would know, he was quite tall. And get a picture of Gary MacDonald and myself refereeing a basketball game in your head. We were known as Mutt and Jeff at that time, so Gary did a lot of the jump balls, and I handled the line. So it was indeed a pleasure to be associated with him over the years, Mr. Speaker. And I think it's an excellent point to be made in terms of compassion. I think that could be shown. Gary MacDonald was a very compassionate person. I'm sure the other people that the member talks about are very compassionate. And I think in the issue of the Regional Residential Services Society and this current strike, I think perhaps that compassion is a word that indeed should be used a lot more than it's being used. And that indeed compassion is not just an idea or a word, but indeed a concept that should be applied right now at this point in time. Because this strike has dragged on for too long, Mr. Speaker. We all realize that as legislators. We all realize that there's nothing you cannot negotiate. There's nothing that you cannot sit down and talk about. There's nothing you can't work out when you really want to get to a solution and find a solution for a problem. And that applies to this strike as well as it would apply to any debate that we're having in this legislature or any topic that we may bring up. Now, Mr. Speaker, I did have the pleasure of just casually talking to a couple of people who are on the picket lines on a regular basis outside. Nothing serious, Mr. Speaker, but I did have one very nice woman offer me a cookie, and the last thing I need in the world is another cookie. But she was nice enough to offer me a cookie as I went through the people who were on the line out there to come into work. And I met a couple of people who have made their point. And I think we've all, well, I did anyway, received a letter which is called A Day in the Life of a Residential Counselor. And I read the letter, Mr. Speaker, and you know, a lot of people in this province would not be familiar with what the work of a residential counselor involves. They wouldn't know. So this letter was a good eye-opener, so to speak, Mr. Speaker, that of the everyday occurrences that these workers have to put up with and go through. The residents have never let them down, was one of the statements that was contained in that letter. There was examples of the continuity of care, of the relationships that are built, and the trust between the residents and between the workers themselves, Mr. Speaker. And I guess when we look outside and we see the picketing and we see the marching, and for those anybody who's watching on TV right now would not hear the chanting that's going on outside. But what simply now, and the most frequent one that I've heard today of all the chants has been, don't debate, arbitrate. So what these workers are saying and calling on this government to do is simply sit down and let's talk. Maybe arbitration is the answer, but they know that there's an answer out there somewhere. But what they have found is a total unwillingness on behalf of this government to listen to what they're saying. And we know, and the workers know right now, that the only people who are suffering from all of this are the residents themselves. It's an unfortunate situation, but Mr. Speaker, it is not a situation that cannot be solved, as I said. It's a situation, I would think, that we are on the eve of a provincial election in Nova Scotia. Does that premier and that government want to go into an election campaign with that strike occurring? Is that going to get them any votes, Mr. Speaker? I think not. So I would think that as we draw, and as every day goes by, we draw closer and closer to a provincial election, I would think that it would be incumbent upon the Premier and incumbent upon his minister responsible and incumbent upon every government member that they would say, it's time we settled things between ourselves and the Regional Residential Services Society workers, Mr. Speaker. So I would imagine, and I would hope, and I've seen in some cases that government members are outside talking to the workers today, and I would hope that each and every one of them gets a chance to listen to the team of people that's talking to MLAs and pays attention and thinks about exactly what they can do to apply pressure from within their own caucus to finally bring this to a head and bring this to a just and fair settlement of this strike so that everybody can get back to the business that they love to do, not just work. Mr. Speaker, we've seen this instance before in this House. Remember Bill 68? Remember nurses? You know, those are caring people too. These are caring people. They were shoved with their pushed up against a brick wall by this very same government, Mr. Speaker. And we saw what they had to go through. And we saw the end result, Mr. Speaker. The end result is that you have a group of people in this province who will never forget. They will never forget what this government did to them, no matter how many years pass. And perhaps the only time they will remember, Mr. Speaker, is when Election Day finally does roll around this time, and I'm sure that it will come to the forefront of their mind. Mr. Speaker, as I said, I wanted to talk about Bill 6, in particular Bill 36. And I had the opportunity to sit down recently and flip through something called the Alternative Provincial Budget, Mr. Speaker, which is put out by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, Mr. Speaker. Now some would say, I imagine some would say that, what are you doing reading this? Isn't this perhaps aligned with another party, so to speak? You know, wouldn't the policy initiatives that are contained in that document not necessarily, well, it's very interesting reading, Mr. Speaker. One of the excerpts that I found that I'd like to pass on to you here today from that document is that, and I quote, over the past 3 years, the Nova Scotia government has proceeded to move away from fair taxation by increasing user fees. We have the highest university tuition in the country. The government has raised the amount that seniors pay for drugs. It has increased home health care costs, ambulance fees, the costs of driver's licenses, car registration, cigarettes, alcoholic beverages, registering births, deaths, and marriages, deed registration, inspections, and even international adoptions, Mr. Speaker. And the list goes on. Through all of those user fees, they amount to a tax increase, Mr. Speaker, because those hurt the people who can't afford, most of all. Some taxes are increasing because these are taxes, these are user fees, and the fees that are charged to all Nova Scotians, regardless of income. Doesn't matter what your income is, when the user fee increases are passed out, you will still pay for those increases. Lo and behold, when it comes time to get your rebate, though, your $155 rum bottle rebate on behalf of this government, it will, at that point in time, it will matter how much you make. Because, as I've stated before, there are just over 300,000 Nova Scotians who will not be getting a check. They won't be getting a check because they don't pay provincial income tax. And they don't pay provincial income tax because they don't make enough money to pay provincial income tax. Some may be on social assistance. They wouldn't pay provincial income tax. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'll ask you the question, and you don't have to answer, but do those people not deserve some form of a rebate? Could they not use some form of a rebate? Would they not be in need of a $155 check from this province? to go out and spend it on some things that they would consider, we wouldn't consider them luxuries perhaps, Mr. Speaker, but they would. They'd be able to go out and purchase some things and contribute towards the economy, Mr. Speaker, because this government has decided to do that kind of a rebate in the manner that it has. They do not get that opportunity. Over 400,000 Nova Scotians will get that rebate, Mr. Speaker. And ironically, every person in this chamber will get that rebate, Mr. Speaker. Every cabinet minister will get the rebate. And the Premier will have the pleasure of signing a check to himself that says, here's your $155. That's what's happening leading up to and because, and primarily because, and probably only because, we are on the eve of a provincial election, Mr. Speaker. That's why all of this is taking place. You know, as I said, Mr. Speaker, when it came to Bill 68, if you recall, when it came to Bill 68 and the nurses, the government had no qualms about then. So this bill, in effect, is nothing but a symptom of a much larger problem, Mr. Speaker. What it means is that this government, before any kind of sound policy, what they put before it is politics. And they have a choice sometimes between policy and politics. This government wins every time they think with politics. We'll put that out forward. Now, Mr. Speaker, we know that, you can have some pretty nasty consequences when politics is allowed to rule the day, Mr. Speaker. So it should not be the prerequisite that's there. Mr. Speaker, this bill, fundamentally, this bill is about whether you believe that Nova Scotians are going to truly be getting a tax cut. Now, Mr. Speaker, we have to remember that with inflation, this one-time tax measure is going to be eroded because the tax brackets and credits are not indexed to inflation. So as of this March, the consumer price index in this province stood at 6.8% over last year. Mr. Speaker, unless there's at least some protection from that kind of inflation, taxes are going to go up as well. So what it means is that $155 vote voucher, Mr. Speaker, that the government's going to pass out is not even going to cover the cost of living this year. And as I said, even worse for those who aren't going to get the $155 check, then it will be they'll be completely exposed to inflation this year, Mr. Speaker. That's wrong. No, it's wrong. It's not, the Premier may say it's not big enough, so maybe there's plans before the election to hand out another $155 check. I don't know. I haven't found, as I said, Mr. Speaker, I haven't found a person in this province who said, $155, you bought my vote, you got my vote. I haven't found anybody yet. And I've been searching since the other day. I can't find anybody who will say, give me that money. But I have found in a lot of cases, a lot of people who said, look, we don't need $155. Put that towards where it should be put towards. Put it towards education. Put it towards health care. Put it towards better roads. Why are you sending it to us when we don't need it in the first place? What are you trying to do? Buy our vote? But Mr. Speaker, I haven't found anybody who said that to me as yet. Now, maybe the government members are hearing exactly the opposite. I don't know. And indeed, I wouldn't, Mr. Speaker, to say that maybe it should be more. What purpose would that serve, Mr. Speaker? What purpose would it serve? The reality about the government's tax scheme, Mr. Speaker, the reality about that tax scheme has never been told to the people of Nova Scotia, because the government is refusing to tell Nova Scotians about the impact of inflation on tax rates. Mr. Speaker, every province, except Manitoba, Nova Scotia, and Newfoundland, have indexed their tax rates to inflation, because those provinces recognize that a tax cut it's nothing but a public relations measure unless you have indexation, Mr. Speaker. Exposing the tax credits or brackets and credits to inflation is the common sense first measure before any tax cut can be given. And what we have in this bill, Mr. Speaker, is, as I said, nothing more than a tax scheme. And if the government was really and truly concerned about high taxes, then they would implement some true tax reform, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Liberal caucus believe in tax cuts, but only, Mr. Speaker, when we can afford them. Now that's pretty clear, Mr. Speaker. Borrowing money for a tax cut does not make any sense. Because when the borrowing ends, then you would give a tax cut. That makes sense, Mr. Speaker. But what happens here is that the Tory credit card has to be cut up, Mr. Speaker, and that's what we've said as Liberals that we'll do. We'll cut that credit card up. So, Mr. Speaker, again, if you want to go back to the $155 vote venture that's contained in this bill and labeled as nothing more than a cynical ploy to try and buy votes. But, Mr. Speaker, you know, it's not, I should say that's not completely fair of me to say that. Not completely fair. And it really doesn't give the Tories enough credit, Mr. Speaker. It's not really a cynical ploy to just buy votes, Mr. Speaker. It is probably one of the most blatant ploys to try and purchase an election that I have ever seen, Mr. Speaker. But you know what? As I said, anybody that I've talked to, I haven't heard from anybody else, but each and every Nova Scotian who has watched this over the past number of weeks knows better, and they're not going to be bought, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the government, to give you an example, is taking a credit card, but it's a credit card with your money, and then they're giving you a cash advance, right? But it's the same as anybody else's credit card. You're going to get a bill. You'll eventually get a bill. Unlike a credit card, the bill won't come due, though, for a few more years, which will allow a lot of interest to accumulate, Mr. Speaker, a lot of interest. And as of last week, it was just last week that this government admitted that they're going to continue to borrow money and borrow more than they earn until the year 2013. So, Mr. Speaker, we might get a check today for $155, but the class of 2013 is going to be handed a bill for a heck of a lot more than that, Mr. Speaker. If you're a Nova Scotian, you pay taxes, your children receive $155, then their sons or daughters, Mr. Speaker, will be handed a bill for $300 in 10 years, for instance, down the road. It doesn't make sense, Mr. Speaker, for one generation to get a tax rebate today so that we can pass that bill on to the children of tomorrow. It simply doesn't make sense, Mr. Speaker. Can you imagine if you went out and got a cash advance on your credit card, Mr. Speaker, for $155, and then go home and tell your kids, you owe me $300? It doesn't make any sense. It just doesn't cut any mustard. But it's what the government is doing, and it's why it all makes no sense. The Premier, Mr. Speaker, knows full well that the debt and the legacy that debt is going to leave is something that has to be stopped. He made that promise, Mr. Speaker. He made that promise in the Blue Book. He made it clear, he made it crystal clear. Open, accountable, transparent government. We will stop borrowing and mortgaging the future of our children and our grandchildren, Mr. Speaker. Well, the Premier used to say, Mr. Speaker, that he cared about the legacy of debt. This bill makes it clear, Mr. Speaker, that he no longer cares. Here's what the Speaker, Mr. Speaker, here's what the Premier used to say. March 21st, 2001, in a speech before the Pictou County Chamber of Commerce, the Premier said, and I quote, "The cost of paying the interest on our debt will soon be $1 billion per year. This is money we don't have to invest in schools, hospital, roads, or a better future for our grandchildren or children and grandchildren." And then again on November 28, 2001, the Premier told the Metro Chamber of Commerce, Mr. Speaker, and I quote, "We've done a lot of borrowing over the past 40 years, and it cost us plenty. In fact, if you go back 10 years to 1991 and add up what all the borrowing has cost us, it's crystal clear why it has to stop. In the last 10 years, Nova Scotians paid out $7.1 billion to service our debt. And while we've slowed the rate our debt is growing, it's still costing us plenty." Unquote. The words of the Premier, Mr. Speaker. Even more, on March 25th, 2002, the Premier said this to the Chronicle Herald. "Last year, you and I and all Nova Scotia taxpayers paid $900 million in interest on our debt. We pay $2.5 million each day. This is more money than we spend to educate all children in grades primary through 12. To be sure, there are some people who suggest that government should continue borrowing on its debt and spending beyond its means. I don't believe there is merit to this argument. Such an approach might feel good today. However, we need to ask ourselves, who pays for it tomorrow?" Well, Mr. Speaker, you know, I'd love to ask the Premier, what changed? What happened between March 25th of 2002, March 21st of 2001, November 28th of 2001, and probably many more occasions? What changed, Mr. Speaker? Why does the Premier no longer care about his legacy of debt that's going to be passed to the next generation? Mr. Speaker, it's a question that Nova Scotians will be asking at the doorstep, I can assure you, at the doorstep in the next election campaign, Mr. Speaker. Again, from the document that I quoted before, the alternative provincial budget, Mr. Speaker, under a heading, "Do people really want tax cuts?" And to summarize, Mr. Speaker, that 3 or 4 years ago, there was poll after poll that showed that the Canadian public had no great desire for tax cuts, especially if it came at the expense of needed services and programs. For example, health care, education, infrastructure, and paying down debt. These were all priorities ahead of tax cuts, according to every poll that was done. And there's evidence now, Mr. Speaker, according to this document, that support now is even lower than it was then, that the promise to cut taxes no longer packs the same punch that it used to. Even in Quebec, which is the highest provincial taxes in this country, Mr. Speaker, the tax issue has fallen far behind the issues such as education and of health, Mr. Speaker. It's gone below the line where people are actually care about that kind, and I can't call it anything else but an attempt to buy votes. People care more about the services that they're being offered. And we've seen in this province that those services are not adequately funded, Mr. Premier. We did. This is a direct quote. I don't know if you've read the alternative provincial budget or not, but it says right here it's fallen off. It's off the radar screen altogether. Tax cuts across this country, Mr. Premier, across the country, it's off the radar screen. The only place that it surfaces now is in this province when it comes time, just before election time, to try and buy some votes with a $155 check, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, you know, as I said, it is cynical to some extent. It's not laughable to any extent because, you know, the $155 check that goes to those Nova Scotians who are going to be lucky enough to get it within the next few weeks is going to be like that, gone. Of course, it will go back, hopefully, into the economy. But, Mr. Speaker, it's the people who are not getting it that worry me the most, the people who could use it the most, the people that this government for 4 years has continued to ignore, not pay any attention to whatsoever. And, Mr. Speaker, if you look about and at the first of my debate here, at the first of my debate, we mentioned the word compassion and tried to tie it into the compassion that's not there on behalf of this government, on behalf of a lot of situations that they have faced over some 4 years, Mr. Speaker. We've seen it time and time again. We saw it with paramedics. We saw it with nurses. We're seeing it now with residential counselors who are currently on strike, Mr. Speaker. And we've seen it in a lot of instances just within general Nova Scotians, ordinary Nova Scotians, who no matter what kind of tax cut this government comes up with, they're going to be paying more out of their pocket anyway, Mr. Speaker, because everything else has gone up. User fees from this government and insurance rates, Mr. Speaker, you name it. It's out of control. But what this government's solution has been, the only solution that the government has said is going to help us all is to get a $155 check. A $155 check, Mr. Speaker. And it would be, as some of the members are saying, they gutted it. You're right. They gutted it. I can't say the other Cape Breton expression, Mr. Speaker, that applies to this situation because it would be in proper language for the chamber, and I won't go there, Mr. Speaker. But I will say, and I should, to my colleagues, Mr. Speaker, that'll be wrapping up very shortly. Look forward to hearing from the next speaker on the various matters in this debate, Mr. Speaker. But I would say that as we draw nearer and nearer to a provincial election, more people, Mr. Premier, Mr. Speaker, more people the Premier knows are starting to climb onto the fact that the monster that we call debt, according to the Chronicle Herald, needs some taming. Needs some taming, Mr. Premier, Mr. Speaker. That indeed, if you look today in the Halifax Herald, you'll see an editorial there, and the end paragraph in that editorial, Mr. Speaker, says that, I quote, "It would be unwise for the Ham government to underestimate the potential reaction by voters to this issue, the issue of the debt. Because the last time the Tories were tossed out of office, a ballooning provincial debt was central to their defeat." So that should hit home, Mr. Speaker, to indicate to the Premier and to the government that indeed it's not something that can be swept under the rug any longer. It's not something that people don't talk about. It's an issue that is forefront in people's minds because they know it affects each and everything that this government does and that future governments will do. And more importantly, Mr. Speaker, it affects our children and our grandchildren and what we are leaving as a legacy to them in the generations to come, Mr. Speaker. And with that thought, I will take my seat. Thank you.
Thank you to the member from Glace Bay. I recognize the member from Timberley Prospect.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I take my spot this afternoon with a few comments. I want you to know, Mr. Speaker, I could say I'm under a little bit of pressure here today because in the gallery opposite, I have one of my past students. And I have the occasion to be meeting with her in the last couple of days on certain occasions. And I know that she's taken out of time from what she's been involved outside. And I was wondering if it'd be appropriate this time to ask Brookside Junior High School graduate Cheryl Joyce to stand in her place. Hi, Cheryl. Thank you, Cheryl. You know, I guess the question always comes down, Mr. Speaker, when you have one of your past students watch you in a different situation. At times it's important to frame the debate, to point out to people in the gallery, although we're not speaking to the people in the gallery, we're speaking in here in an important debate on Bill 36. And the litmus test for this MLA is always simply this, Mr. Speaker. Is there anything in this particular bill, the financial measures bill, Is there anything in that bill that's worthy of support that will help the people of Timberley Prospect, that will help that young woman from the RRS labor interruption that's taking place? Are there things in this legislation? Because, you know, so often, Mr. Speaker, in opposition, we're criticized for always being negative, opposing everything. So I think it's important that we look at some of the issues that we have before us, and we look at some of the things that have to be decided with regards to this piece of legislation. Bill 36. I want to tell you, Bill 36, in my opinion, includes, and it's an omnibus bill, which means it includes a lot of different clauses that will inevitably end up in law amendments. And when it's in law amendments, and that wonderful tradition that we have in this legislature that sets the example for other legislatures when it comes to law amendments. And Mr. Speaker, as you well know, I'm proud to say that I'm on that committee, that over in the Red Room, when this particular piece of legislation goes to the Red Room, there will be an opportunity for Nova Scotians to come forward and have their say on some of the important parts of this piece of legislation. But I want you to know that upon review, there's some parts of this legislation that I find really quite despicable. And I can mention some specific examples. I can point out to the members opposite that if they know some of these names, they should be well aware of the fact that we are talking workers who work in the casino, workers who have been concerned about their health, been concerned about what they feel is going to be a safe place to work. Yet, when it comes to this piece of legislation, we see that this government is prepared to make exceptions. Prepared to make exceptions when it comes to the occupational health and safety of workers such as Andrea Skinner. Now, I had the opportunity, and our caucus had the opportunity, to meet with Heather Crow. Heather, of course, is that woman from Ottawa who worked in the businesses in the Ottawa area, restaurants, where, of course, she suffered from secondhand smoke. And, Mr. Speaker, putting it rather graphically, she's dying. She's dying. And Mrs. Crow has taken upon herself this campaign to point out to governments, to point out to elected officials such as ourselves, what we have to deal with an issue such as the casino secondhand smoking problem. A member from Sackville Beaverbank is quoted as saying, you know, I wish the people from the HRM would have just left it all alone, that they wouldn't have brought it up again for public debate. That, after all, is our role as legislators, is to bring forward legislation that can be debated openly, and that we can discuss one way or another what would happen to that piece of legislation when we look at secondhand smoke at the casino in Nova Scotia. That exception being made, that is one reason I can tell you that under no circumstances am I interested in supporting Bill 36. Now, we can get down to this $155 analogy that my friend from Cape Breton Centre brought forward before, and I can think of a lot of other reasons to use that $155. I've run into people this weekend who said to me, because I was out doing some door knocking, and I want you to tell you, they're saying, keep that $155 bill, keep it. Pave the road in Halliburton Hills. Take care of where the bus gets stopped on McDonald Lake Road. Or more importantly, give that $155 so that this settlement can take place and this RRS company can get in there and get these young men and women that we see in this building or out in the street back to work. Get them back to work. Take that $155. Instead of taking that $155 and giving it to Nova Scotians, many of them are saying, we don't need that $155. That $155 can be used in a lot better way. For example, and I want you to know, I'm proud to say that my friend from Cape Breton Centre introduced me to some outstanding young men from his community in New Waterford. When Carlton MacDonald says to me, and incidentally, Carlton MacDonald is named after Carlton Fisk. Carlton Fisk, that legendary Boston Red Sox catcher who waved that ball fair, right? Waved it fair. Well, I want you to know, when Carlton MacDonald sits in the Midtown, sits in that particular restaurant that we were sitting in and says, there's the way to use that $155. Take that $155 instead of having this enticement so that you'll have to vote for a particular party, and put it there in the hands of this company so that they can offer a fair wage settlement to these hard-working young men and women that we see in this house, that we see outside, that have been here all the time. Or take that $155. Take that $155, as the principal of Sir John A. Macdonald High School says, we can use that money at Sir John A. Sir John A., whose librarian, Grace Rogers, has said to me, we have a library with renovations on the way that I might not even have windows for. And yet I'm going to get a check for $155. The donation will be made to Sir John A. Macdonald's High School Library by Grace Rogers, by the MLA for Timberley Prospect. We do not want to be insulted with a $155 enticement. And I won't use the B word, Mr. Speaker, because I know you've corrected me before. We don't need that $155. It should be used in areas throughout the province and in the constituency of Timberley Prospect in particular, where it could actually have some real impact. Now, Mr. Speaker, it was a busy weekend, as it always is for us, as you well know. And one of the hot topics that I had the occasion to deal with is I was fortunate enough to mail out 8,000 mail-outs on insurance rates in this province. The response has been phenomenal. When you get responses that are given back to our office that are addressed to us personally, when you get a response to the leader of the NDP that, quote, said, "Rock on, Darrell, go get 'em," quote unquote, that says to me that young men and women, maybe because of the expression they use, "rock on, Darrell, go get 'em," but let me tell you, they're engaged, they're involved, and they are going to remember when they go to the ballot box $155 or else that insurance rates in this province are disastrous and that this government has done nothing about it, yet today they come forward with one of these half measures, and that was the plan that we've been waiting for by the member for Hants West, who is responsible for skyrocketing insurance. I'll tell you, Nova Scotians and the people of Timberley Prospect will not let this government remember that. They will punish them at the ballot box because they feel they're being insulted. They're being treated disrespectfully. And I can mention some examples, Mr. Speaker, as you're expecting me to bring forward. Some of them are classmates of Cheryl Joyce. Tony Roding cannot get back and forth to his university classes because he can't get his vehicle insured. Robert Butler cannot get his van insured because he customized it, of all things. He put stripes on it, and it got customized, and therefore the insurance rates. What about the complaint that I hear from some people, particularly the member from Chester St. Margaret's should know this, that at one time the postal rate was BOJ1TO. And now the postal rate is B3Z. And all of a sudden, we have higher insurance rates. Now, has Bill 36 addressed this issue? The answer is no. That's the sort of thing that the people in Dover, the people in McGraw's Cove, the people in the Peggy's Cove Road are going to remember. And that's the sort of thing that a $155 enticement is not going to, under any circumstances, have their vote for this particular political party. Mr. Speaker, you want another use for $155? And it might be a bit self-serving on my part. But let me tell you, and I know that Cheryl will be aware of who this young woman is, I'm proud to say that I have a daughter who is currently planting trees north of Temiskaming. Now, I must tell you, Mr. Speaker, I didn't know there was much north of there, except for trees, but she's there planting more trees. And her response, and the response of students that she attends the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design on is, you want a good use for $155, help university students in this province with their tuition. Help them with a meaningful loan remission program. Use that $155 for that reason, instead of saying, here's $155 that arrives 2 days before we're going to actually get in there and put our X in the ballot box, and they're going to remember that. Nova Scotians are insulted by that type of old-time politics. And that's the message from my daughter and graduate students across this province. They are looking at one particular thing, that $155 could be used a lot better when it comes to that particular issue of assisting students when it comes to the debts which they are facing. I can go from my daughter at 21 to be clear, to Rufus Covey, 82 years of age. Rufus Covey, who lives in the riding of Chester St. Margaret's, is quoted in the Daily News today about an ongoing concern. Does Bill 36 do anything, and has this government done anything about the problem of assessments? The answer is no. And Rufus Covey, that $155 is not going to be of any particular assistance to him. I'm sure instead Mr. Covey would like to see an answer given to the problem of assessments. He would like some form of direction from this government, because Rufus Covey is one of those legendary characters on the St. Margaret's Bay who owns property on the salt water. I know those young men and women are aware of the fact that do you actually have the opportunity to ever own property on salt water anymore, or even on fresh water when it comes to lakes. Mr. Covey would like to be able to pass this land on to his grandchildren. Instead, the assessment is through the roof because of where he is fortunate enough to have lived for these 80-plus years. And what has this government done about that issue? They have done nothing. 4 long years. And I know there's members opposite, members who represent constituencies along the South Shore. They must be tired, sick and tired of hearing me talk about this topic. But this government has done nothing about the issue. Assessments continue to rise. There seems to be no leadership at all from the ministers involved, and lots of excuses. We had a volunteer planning system. The volunteer planning people went around this province. They listened to Nova Scotians. I attended many of those sessions, Mr. Speaker. I was present. I heard Nova Scotians upset. But what does this government do? And what does an omnibus bill such as Bill 36 do when it comes to addressing this issue? The answer is nothing. And coastal communities continue to suffer. Coastal communities that are in no circumstances going to be enticed by $155. They're going to say, I would rather have it so that I could use this piece of land to pass on to my grandchildren or my great-grandchildren, and I can't even pay the taxes when it comes due again this year. That's an issue that this government should have taken on and dealt with, as opposed to RRSS and the strike and the deadlines and the various other things that are not being dealt with by this government. Now, Mr. Speaker, I can go on at length with various other things that the $155 could be used for. I can point out to the members opposite the Nova Scotians are insulted, to say the least, when it comes to this particular, let's say, political agenda. People are going to see through that. They have seen through it, Mr. Speaker. They are not going to accept that when it comes to having terrible roads, a library in your local high school that's inadequate, tuition fees that are through the roof, and an unfortunate labor strike taking place outside of our door, that instead this $155 is going to, after all, just allow Nova Scotians, to forget about it. We'll take care of you. Well, let me tell you, Mr. Speaker, that paternalistic approach, that doesn't work anymore in this province. Voters, the electorate, they want to be served. They want a form of delivery which says they are being listened to. And is this government listening to Nova Scotians? I say they are not, Mr. Speaker. I've received numerous emails on various topics, from schools to subdivisions to the lack of planning to tuitions. I have heard these. I've brought these emails forward in this House, Mr. Speaker, and let me tell you that Nova Scotians want to be listened to. They want to be treated respectfully. Now, I've heard the member from Cape Breton Centre stand in this place many times. And I want you to tell the members here, particularly some of the young men and women who are here from Cape Breton, nobody has a deeper feel for the history of this province and the history of Cape Breton than the member from Cape Breton Centre. And I want to thank the member from Cape Breton Centre for giving me a book, actually a Christmas gift from a caucus member. I was impressed. And in return, well, we won't say what I gave him for a gift. But I had the opportunity to read Red McLaughlin's book, and the member from Cape Breton Centre gave me that book. And I don't know if you've read that biography, Mr. Speaker, but let me tell you something. There's a book that members opposite should read. Oh my God, he was a Labour member. And yes, he spent a few weeks in jail. In fact, to be very clear, he did time in Dorchester. But the lessons he could give members opposite, because of the deep connection that he had with the people of Glace Bay and the New Waterford area and the collieries that he represented. And that's what's missing from this government, Mr. Speaker. That's what's missing from this government. They are not connecting. They are not listening to Nova Scotians. They're certainly not listening to young people when it comes to the loan remission program. They're certainly not listening to insurance concerns that are being brought up by this party that we're hearing back from. And they are certainly not listening to these people who are in the gallery, who are out on the street, who've been here day after day after day. Now, the reputation of a government is based on not what words you deliver, but do you listen to Nova Scotians? And Mr. Speaker, the verdict will be delivered soon. This government has not listened to Nova Scotians. It has not listened to the people of this province. And I will assure you, Mr. Speaker, that when the time comes and when they do go to the ballot box, Nova Scotians will punish this government because they have not been listening. They have not been listening in New Waterford. They've been not listening out here on the street. They've been not listening down in New Minas and Kentville. And a government that does not listen will reflect the arrogance that will eventually turn to defeat. Now, Mr. Speaker, as you're well aware, I can't talk for at length today because of a medical appointment that's forthcoming. And I want the members opposite to know that I have many other comments to make when it comes to this particular bill. When it goes over to law amendments, it will be an opportunity to listen to Nova Scotians. But I'm proud to say this is a piece of legislation that I cannot support. It does nothing for Timberley Prospect. More importantly, it does nothing for a daughter who's working her way back into university. It does nothing for a young person who sits in our gallery today that I'm proud to say is a student. And I want you to know, Mr. Speaker, that that legislation will come back to haunt this government when the time comes when we go out there and actually ask for Nova Scotians' votes. I thank you for your time.
Thank you. I want to recognize the member from Victoria.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's always a hard act to follow, the member, when he's going full steam ahead. But, however, Mr. Speaker, I will attempt to come as close as I can. Mr. Speaker, I want to talk for a few moments today on Bill 36, the Financial Measures Act. Mr. Speaker, I won't take an awful lot of time, but, however, there is a lot to say about Bill 36, and there are enough information before all of us today to keep us going for quite a period of time. Mr. Speaker, there were several aspects of this bill besides the tax rebate and the tax cut schemes that affect Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, for this government, the Financial Measures Act has become a centerpiece of this government's last gasp before going to the polls. Mr. Speaker, many of us will say that this government's plan to paint a rosy picture for Nova Scotians before they go to the polls, as the former speaker made reference to, could very well backfire. Mr. Speaker, with this government's negotiating skills, it's no wonder that this government has made so many mistakes in the last number of years. They don't negotiate, that's fine. They have no skills. Mr. Speaker, let's begin with their negotiating skills they used on the casino relative to the smoking issue, Mr. Speaker. That's one example. They lost that one hands down. And let's talk about smoking for a few minutes, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, half an hour. A healthy workplace, Mr. Speaker, a healthy workplace is one of the most important things you hear people talk about today. And what did they look for in a healthy workplace, Mr. Speaker? A smoke-free environment. That's one of the things, Mr. Speaker. Why? Mr. Speaker, there are the numbers that's before us today, particularly with lung cancer and other forms of cancer, heart disease and other illnesses related to secondhand smoke and smoking. And I wonder, Mr. Speaker, has the Minister of Health, I'm not sure if the Minister of Health smokes or not. I'm not sure. No, but I often wonder, has she seen somebody die with lung cancer, as many of us have? Mr. Speaker, also, why is this government so stubborn in fighting with the municipalities on this issue? The municipalities are way out front when it comes to smoke-free legislation. Most municipalities across the province, Mr. Speaker, are 100% smoke-free. No, but our casinos are not, Mr. Speaker. But we may have learned a lesson last week in the decision by the lady who fought her case with the unemployment insurance. That may open the gate, Mr. Speaker, to further repercussions to this government relative to the smoking. And I think, Mr. Speaker, that's the least the government could do today. That's the least they could do, is try, make an attempt to provide a healthy environment for Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, it doesn't cost much, and I do believe, Mr. Speaker, the government that will enforce a 100% smoke-free environment will be the winner when we go to the polls the next time. But, Mr. Speaker, this bill simply raises the white flag about a government standing up for Nova Scotians. Simply put, this provision in the Act is one of the most important ones. If the government requires legislative changes, then there is no reason the government couldn't call back this legislation and make this change. Because you remember, Mr. Speaker, Bill 68? We all remember Bill 68 in this chamber. When it came to browbeaten nurses, the government had no qualms about that, but when it comes to protecting the health of Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, it shows contempt. Mr. Speaker, this bill is nothing but a symptom of a larger problem. It means the government is putting politics before any sound policies. When it comes to a choice between policy and politics, politics win out every time under this government, Mr. Speaker. We all know the deadly consequences when politics is allowed to rule the day, especially when it comes to occupational health and safety, whether it be secondhand smoke or in a coal mine. Mr. Speaker, I find it completely illogical that this government is given a tax cut while it still spends more money than it has taken in. Now, Mr. Speaker, that's called good management, Mr. Speaker. I wonder if any of us managed our affairs at home like that. You spend more money, you keep adding onto your credit card, and you spend more money than you're taking in. Mr. Speaker, that's, in my view, that's not very good. That's not very good. That's not sound management. But you know the great irony here, Mr. Speaker, is under the pre-1999 accounting rules, this budget would be approximately $118 million in the red. Now think about it, Mr. Speaker. Under the old accounting, the government would be $118 million in the hole or in the red. You see, Mr. Speaker, we didn't have tangible capital asset accounting like today, and we think it is a good change. Many of us believe it's a change in the right direction. But just because you can amortize your capital, every capital project, doesn't mean that you can spend more than you earn. The way this finance minister talks about capital assets, you would think they found a money printing machine somewhere, only for them. When you spend more than you earn, you are asking for trouble, Mr. Speaker. If the economy falters, if interest rate goes up, all of a sudden, government revenues dry up with that, Mr. Speaker. Many of us remember, and we were here back in 1992, when the government of Nova Scotia hit the wall. Anybody around at that time will tell you that government could not sustain itself, and it was in a free fall. Not because of what they did in 1992, but for the overspending in 1989, when the economy was sound and it was in good shape. So what happens in 1993? We ended up with a $1.1 billion deficit for 1 year. Mr. Speaker, think about it. $1.1 billion deficit for 1 year. Mr. Speaker, at that time, every government had to deal with that legacy, and even this one. So why repeat the mistakes of the past, Mr. Speaker? That's a question on many minds of Nova Scotians today. Why didn't we learn from the past? Why are we making the same mistake again? Mr. Speaker, while the economy is relatively healthy, now is the time to pay down our debt. Now is the time to find ways to save some money. In that way, we'll be ready in case of another recession. Mr. Speaker, we can't go on forever. There's bound to be a recession. Mr. Speaker, it took most of a decade to recover from the last recession, and in some ways, we are still paying for it. And it's not an accident, Mr. Speaker, that debt service costs are almost at $1 billion. That is no accident. It happened because people 13 years ago decided it was okay to spend when they should have at least made an attempt to pay on our debts. In the 1980s, the attitude in the 1980s, Mr. Speaker, was don't worry. We had gas offshore. Sable is going to save us. We can invest now because the economy will grow later. Mr. Speaker, that was the theme of the 80s. Don't worry. It's on and upward. Mr. Speaker, at least Premier Buchanan said he had a plan, albeit a faulty one. Mr. Speaker, you can't grow your way out of a $12 billion debt problem. Mr. Speaker, it doesn't work that way. Cutting on an ever-growing economy is simply bad fiscal management. So what we have here is a government that does not care about the future. It cares about the election around the corner, but not the welfare of our children and our children's future. The growing debt threatens a whole generation, and the government is saying, don't worry, our future is bright, be happy. This bill gives a tax cut that we simply cannot afford. Worse, it loans people $155 today that the government will have to get back from them over the next number of years. If not them, their families, or their children, or our grandchildren. You see, Mr. Speaker, that is just not a deferred taxation. It means the tax break of today will mean a tax increase of tomorrow. Borrowing $118 million to give back $68 million is bad math. It's bad public policy, and it is bad politics. Mr. Speaker, we believe Nova Scotians can't be bought. Mr. Speaker, and I do believe that this bill is an insult to their intelligence. Mr. Speaker, and I believe shame on the Premier and shame on the Minister of Finance. Mr. Speaker, who cares about the debt? Some people will say, who cares about the debt when we need better health care and when we need better education Does anyone care? Who cares about the debt when we need new roads? Mr. Speaker, I'll be the first to admit that debt in itself will not cross the minds of many Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, the effect of debt on this province, Mr. Speaker, is staggering, and I think it's the government's responsibility, and it is their duty to get the message out to Nova Scotians where we stand with this staggering debt. So why should we care about our debt? Because debt servicing charges represents more money than we spend on education. And Mr. Speaker, that's wrong. Imagine every year for the foreseeable future, $1 billion will go to banks to cover off interest on the debt and never paying back on the principal. Mr. Speaker, given the tax cut, while we keep adding to the debt is inconceivable. It is wrong, and eventually it will bring this government into very serious trouble. As we said before, the tax cut of today is an increase of tomorrow. Every dollar we pay in debt is another dollar that will have to be paid back in higher taxes and higher user fees for all Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, and not just those who pay income tax. The tax cut goes to over 4,000 income tax paying Nova Scotians. But what about the countless others who will have to pay higher fees and consumption tax on things like electricity, home heating fuel, oil or gasoline? What about car insurance, Mr. Speaker? So everyone who pays income tax gets a break, while those who pay all the other fees and taxes will eventually have to pay for the debt. That's wrong, Mr. Speaker. And we believe that's why this bill needs some scrutiny. Mr. Speaker, the other thing the government has ignored is that it has not indexed tax brackets and credits to inflation. Something our party has called for in the past and will again when we can afford it. Give a tax break, Mr. Speaker, when we can afford it. The lack of indexation means that any tax cut is not going to last. You know what that means, Mr. Speaker? It means more taxes and not less. Indexation means freezing taxes at the current level. It does not mean tax relief. It means that in the future, governments won't be able to count on a secret backdoor tax increase. Mr. Speaker, indexation means that people will see their tax erode away by bracket creep. It means that the tax cut today will be taken back tomorrow because of inflation. In Manitoba, they cut taxes as well, but they failed to index tax brackets. That means the tax cut in Nova Scotia and Manitoba will be gone in short order because of inflation. This is not tax cut at all, and that is why we need, Mr. Speaker, to continue to hammer home what's wrong with this bill. Taxation without indexation is a short-term measure. But our leader and our caucus position is clear. We do favor tax relief, but not while we have to borrow to pay for it. It simply does not make sense to borrow more than we earn. As I repeated earlier, borrow more than you earn and still talk about tax cut. Mr. Speaker, in 1998, in the 1998 election, John Ham promised no new taxes and a $50 BST home heating rebate for every household in Nova Scotia. That would cost the province $17.8 million in fiscal year 1998 and 99. Taxation Taxation was not a large issue, although the NDP leader offered to scrap the BST, as an article in the Herald of February 24, 1998. During the 1999 election campaign, tax cuts were not front and center. In fact, the Tory tax cut garnered very little attention compared to the Health Investment Fund, Cisco funding for primary education. In reality, the tax cut issue seems to be a last-minute addition to this government's platform. When initially asked whether he would promise a tax cut, the Premier replied that Nova Scotians would not believe that promise because they know it wasn't doable. Mr. Speaker, he went on to say that he would run a believable campaign, indicating once again that the tax cut idea was not initially believable. That's what the Premier said when he was campaigning in 1999. Mr. Speaker, surprisingly, when the Premier announced his platform on the 25th of June 1999, tax cuts were part of the Blue Book. Perhaps no person was more surprised with the election outcome than Premier Ham himself. This has become more apparent every day since he took office. For example, initially the tax cut promise would cost $110 million. That has subsequently risen to $140 million based on 10% of the revenues. The 10% tax cut promise was simplistic in that it was never really elaborated on in terms of what it meant until well into this government's mandate. The vagueness of the promise is part of its strength. When and if they ever thought they would fulfill the promise, nobody would know exactly what this 10% meant. We know now what it means, Mr. Speaker. It means that the government has scrapped the tax cut in favour of a one-time vote-buying scheme, a scheme that has been hoisted on Nova Scotians with, guess what, Mr. Speaker? Borrowed money. Mr. Speaker, the Paul Martin budget of February 2000 marked a turning point in Canadian history as it contained the most significant tax cut in the country's history. At the same time, he eliminated what has become known as bracket creep, which is the full indexation of tax brackets and credits of inflation. Again, bracket creep results in people being pushed into higher tax brackets as their income rises with inflation. The result is that the tax rate rises even though income do not increase in real terms. For finance ministers across Canada, the federal tax cut and the end of bracket creep would mean a reduction in revenues because provincial taxes were set at a percentage of the federal rate. Not for the finance minister of Nova Scotia. He delinked and in effect raised taxes. The loss of bracket creep would be particularly alarming to any government that promised tax cuts because bracket creep provided a built-in hidden tax increase over the years. Even if a tax cut is given, finance ministers could always rely on bracket creep as an extra source of income. Mr. Speaker, the only solution for the province was to delink with the federal rate and set their own rates. The new system was called tax on income. Delinking meant that provincial taxes would remain the same and that the federal tax cut would have no impact on provincial revenues. Mr. Speaker, there are significant advantages to tax on income because it allows the province to be flexible with tax credit, but at the same time, it is detrimental to the taxpayer because there is no corresponding tax reduction when the federal rate drops. What is more insidious is that while bracket creep was eliminated federally, it was continued provincially because of the delinking, even though the province could have chose to index credits and brackets at that time. The insidious part of bracket creep is that it amounts to a hidden tax increase. Even if there is a provincial tax cut, the province can make it up over time through bracket creep. Right. Mr. Speaker, in order to expose the hidden tax increase, our finance critic at the time, the member from Lunenburg West, embarked upon a campaign to get the government to commit to end to bracket creep. The reason for the call was as followed. Full indexation would amount to a tax-free and a fundamental reform of the provincial tax system. Indexing tax credit and tax brackets to inflation would provide fairness, transparency, and accountability to the tax system. The call for a tax freeze was followed up with a bill that would set up a committee to explore possible avenues for meaningful tax reform while repeating the above position. The bill and the call for an end to bracket creep received some media attention and the qualified support of our NDP finance critic. Of course, the bill was never passed, but it was debated. The bottom line, however, Mr. Speaker, is that when tax brackets fail to increase with inflation, taxpayers are hit with a subtle but very real tax increase, so that any tax cut without first ending bracket creep will be eroded over time. Mr. Speaker, in the end, this government isn't given a permanent tax cut. What we have instead is a temporary measure that will be lost over a short time. When people understand that, they will be very upset with this government, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, you know this government likes to bring up issues that are irrelevant, like the previous government's records of fiscal this government's record on fiscal management. The reality is that this government and every government since 1993 has been trying to deal with the legacy of the 1980s and the early 1990s. Mr. Speaker, in 2001, the Auditor General's report, it said, in that report, the Auditor General said this: in the early 90s, Nova Scotia was running huge deficit and debt was skyrocketing. Actions by successive governments from 1993 on have slowed the pace, but the goal of achieving a balanced budget has still not been met, and the province's debt continues to grow. There are other overriding questions which remain to be answered. Is the balance in the budget enough? Aren't significant sustained surpluses necessary to really start reducing the debt? Mr. Speaker, much has been done in the past 10 years, but it was a result of actions by every government since 1993, including the McLennan government, who had to wrestle with the legacy of John Buchanan and the Don Cameron governments. Everybody knows that the Minister of Finance was part of those governments, but I know that was a long time ago, Mr. Speaker. The lesson of that time, however, has not been learned. This government has made strides in the last couple of years, has previous governments, and in less partisan moments, the minister has acknowledged this. When this tax scheme went forward and the budget tabled, Mr. Speaker, then that's when things went wrong. The last budget marked a turning point in Nova Scotia's history, and the lessons of the past have been thrown aside, and the floodgates of spending have been opened again. Mr. Speaker, the borrowing continues to put the future generations at risk, as an unprecedented tax scheme has been unleashed upon the people of Nova Scotia. The $155 tax rebate check is nothing more than a vote-buying scheme. And it is an indication of the kind of cynical politics that the Premier promised he would not engage in. But, Mr. Speaker, turning to the past, let's go back to 1989. On May 5th, 1989, the Honourable Greg Kerr tabled an optimistic and glowing budget. In that budget, the economy was growing, unemployment was down, but there were some signs that that would not continue. Greg Kerr might have recognized it at that time, but at that time, it was probably too late. Bill Gillis warned the government of that the day of reckoning was near. Well, Mr. Speaker, the day of reckoning did come, and it hit this Tory government over the head like a hammer. In 1991, another budget by Mr. Kerr showed that there was a recession. Unemployment was up, revenues were down. Revenues were down from transfers, interest rates were at about 13%, and the ground pressure was on the verge of collapse. Mr. Speaker, the government of the day was warned by Bill Gillis that the day of reckoning was coming, and he was right. Today, Mr. Speaker, we are back to where we were in 1989. The government is relying on a growing economy rather than a sound fiscal management. Borrowing continues unabated. And, Mr. Speaker, the warning signs are there. Alarm bells should be going off all over Nova Scotia because this government is not ready when the next day of reckoning comes. It's around the corner, Mr. Speaker, and it is Nova Scotians who will suffer. Interest rates are at their lowest level since the Depression. The U.S. economy is slowing, and the growth in the offshore has stalled. This is not the time to open the floodgates of spending. This is not the time to keep borrowing, and it is not the time to implement a tax scheme aimed at buying votes. Mr. Speaker, this government is bragging because it is spending $250 million on capital. They have justified the borrowing by saying it's for schools and it's for roads and it's for education. Well, Mr. Speaker, let's go back to the budget of May 14, 1991. At that time, the government borrowed $260 million for capital. Imagine, Mr. Speaker, 10 years ago today, the province borrowed $10 million more than the government of John Hamm for schools. Schools that are now falling apart and falling into the ground. Adjusted to today's dollars, that figure is probably much higher. We can't justify borrowing by saying it's an investment. They did the same thing under Buchanan, and look at the mess, Mr. Speaker, we're in today. Every government since 1993 had to deal with the Buchanan legacy of debt. Every government since 1993 has faced debt service and charges based on the incompetence of the late 1980s and the early 1990s. Make no mistake, Mr. Speaker, Dr. Gillis said that the day of reckoning is not far off. If our interest rates goes up, if the economy shrinks, Nova Scotia is in big trouble. And the most alarming part of this budget is not the numbers, it's not even the vote buying, it's the attitude of this government and this Premier. Their attitude, we believe, will ruin Nova Scotians. The Finance Minister said, yes, we are borrowing and we make no apologies. Well, Mr. Speaker, who will pay the back? Who will make the payments of our children and our grandchildren? The Minister will be collecting his pension by the time the bill comes due for the reckless borrowing of this government. Mr. Speaker, the Premier's attitude is very disturbing. The Premier said he would not add to the debt. He said he would not borrow against his grandchildren. He said he would not cynically try to buy votes. Mr. Speaker, the Premier's cavalier attitude will bankrupt this province, and he is mortgaging his grandchildren's future. The tax issue is an important issue, no question, but let's first look at the $155 vote kickback. I'm sure many Nova Scotians could use that money, Mr. Speaker, no question. The sad part is that those who need it most may not receive it. Those on low fixed income and social assistance will not see a dime, while every member of this legislature, every member of cabinet, the premier, all the members in this House will receive that $155 check. Is that fair? Is that progressive? Let's look at the tax cut itself. Now, I've heard the finance minister talk about Nova Scotia, that Nova Scotia will have the lowest tax in the country. Well, Mr. Speaker, that simply will not hold water. As I mentioned before, what we end up with a short-term tax loan. Again, that means that over time, the tax will be clawed back by bracket creep. Mr. Speaker, New Brunswick has indexed their tax brackets and credits, meaning that fewer lower-income people pay taxes in New Brunswick. Take, for example, the basic personal amount. Mr. Speaker, in Nova Scotia, it will mean $7,231. In New Brunswick, it will mean $7,751 for a difference of $525. Mr. Speaker, that's just one part of it. The tax brackets in New Brunswick have a higher threshold than Nova Scotia, so the finance minister's claim does not hold up under scrutiny. Mr. Speaker, today's tax cut is a temporary measure that will be eroded away because of hidden bracket creep taxes caused by inflation. Inflation will wipe out the tax cut in short order. Last year alone, inflation was close to 5%. Mr. Speaker, it was because of this government, of the Buchanan government's overspending and spending money that we didn't have. Mr. Speaker, it wasn't right then, and it's certainly not right today. I think, Mr. Speaker, we have hit a danger zone, and this government is pretending that there is no problem. That is why, Mr. Speaker, that we talk on this bill at every opportunity we get. So that, hoping that this government will see that Nova Scotians are not in a position to accept a $155 check. So this government will be re-elected, and that this government will go on with their overspending and continue to spend money that we don't have. I thank you for your time, Mr. Speaker, and I will turn the floor over to another speaker.
The honourable leader of the official opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm very pleased to rise this afternoon to participate in the debate on Bill 36, also, of course, known, Mr. Speaker, as an act respecting certain financial measures. Now, the last time I got up to speak in relation to this bill, it was, of course, with respect to the hoist motion that no doubt you will recall very well, Mr. Speaker. And at that time, I took the opportunity to explore some of the things that my colleagues in the Liberal caucus were saying and to point out various of the contradictions in what they were saying. And Mr. Speaker, I must say that was rather entertaining to do, but in the end, not very instructive, because I see that the Liberals are continuing along that vein. And I think it's unfortunate because they could engage in a constructive debate on this bill, and I think we're all worse off when it simply becomes rhetorical. And frankly, Mr. Speaker, is without any kind of real substance at all. Mr. Speaker, the one thing that I will note is that the honourable member from Glace Bay did begin his speech by talking a little bit about the workers who are here at the legislature today, and in relation to the fact that with respect to an act respecting certain financial measures, there's nothing in the budget that deals appropriately with those workers. So in that regard, it it is a valid point, I think, to be made in respect to this act, because it points out something that is missing as opposed to something that is here. And of course, debates around the principle of the bill are very important. And I wanted to point out, Mr. Speaker, there are certain things that I think the Minister of Community Services in particular, but other members of the Cabinet are doing a great disservice, and I think showing a profound disrespect to those people who are here in continuing to try and spin the illusion or to paint the picture that somehow the package that is being put forward on behalf of the Department of Community Services through their agents are fair to the workers with the RRSS. They keep talking about a pension plan, for example, and this is, I think, one of the things that they find most annoying, because the reality is it's not a pension plan at all, Mr. Speaker. What they're proposing is to increase contributions to an RRSP, and in and of itself, that only applies to a less than half of the bargaining unit, Mr. Speaker. So many people in that bargaining unit won't reap any benefit whatsoever from the proposal that's being made by the Department of Community Services through their agent. And the reason why they object so strenuously to this, and the reason why it is so disrespectful, is because it paints a picture to the public which is essentially untrue. And what greater disrespect could you have for working people than to try to go over their heads to the public and misrepresent the facts about the negotiations that they are engaged in? This is tremendously disrespectful, and I think, given the opportunity to comment it within the context of financial measures, it's important that we do that we get that information out to people, because if collective bargaining is to take place appropriately, Mr. Speaker, it has to take place in an atmosphere of good faith. And when you mislead and misrepresent the position of people, you are not bargaining in good faith, no matter what you say. So I think the first thing that the government has to get over, the first hurdle they have to get over, is the idea that they are somehow going to be able to spin their way out of this, that if they can just say it over and over again enough times, that somehow people out there will believe that the situation is somehow different than it actually is. I wanted to point out, and I think it's interesting, Mr. Speaker, to just for a second think about the history of this, because Mr. Speaker, many of these facilities have been around for a long time, and I was speaking with one of the workers who was telling me that his particular facility had been around for some 17 years, and so this is not something that has been created recently. It has a long history to it, and I always find it instructive whenever I'm looking at a labor dispute to look back at the history of the development of those circumstances. And sometimes, Mr. Speaker, they're quite revealing. And although the members of the Liberal caucus haven't mentioned this, the reality is that back in 1996, when the Liberals were in power, one of the things that they promised to do, and many of the people working in those facilities really wanted to see happen, was the government of the day to bring in legislation that was going to govern those facilities. And in fact, Mr. Speaker, as I understand it, I wasn't here at the time, but as I understand it, there was a commitment made at that time that legislation would be coming forward so that many of the problems that were developing around these facilities would be dealt with. Instead, Mr. Speaker, only interim standards were brought forward in the fall of that year, and still to this day, there has not been legislation brought forward to deal with many of these outstanding practical issues. So it's not, the history of this is that this has been a sector which the government by and large has not paid attention to. And I think our responsibility is to point out to people that when you reach an impasse like you have on this, oftentimes what you're seeing is really just the tip of the iceberg, that things have been building for many, many years, and there is a continuity and a long history of problems that have arisen over time. So I wanted to make those points, and I wanted to make them more or less in the context of this bill and in the context of what my colleague from Glace Bay had said earlier. And I also think it's just worthwhile that we keep reminding these guys over here that the members of the employees of Local 66 aren't going anywheres. Mr. Speaker, if you've been down to your office lately, you know they're not going anywheres. So that was the first thing that I wanted to mention. Many people who are watching this, whether they're watching it on television or whether they're in the gallery, or whether they're watching it, I understand you can get it through the closed circuit on the intranet that the government has. No matter where they're watching it, they should know the importance of this piece of legislation. This Financial Measures Act is a matter on which the government could fall if they were to lose a vote in this House on the Financial Measures Act. That would essentially be a crisis in the confidence of the government. As you know, Mr. Speaker, this is essentially the route that happened the last time the government fell. It was a crisis of confidence in the then Liberal government, and the result was an election that you no doubt remember well, ending in July of 1999. In fact, that very election, of course, which put you in the esteemed position that you're in now, Mr. Speaker. So these issues are of tremendous importance and weight when it comes to the operation of this House and the operation of government. So it is this section of legislation that puts into law the statutory requirements that implement the budget that was read by the Minister of Finance. And it deals with those initiatives that were announced and the ones that were ferreted out as a result of the examinations, of the estimates of the various ministers, both in this chamber and in the subcommittee. But interestingly enough, that's not all that this piece of legislation does. It also deals with initiatives that in fact had nothing to do with the budget, wasn't part of the throne speech, wasn't part of the budget address, wasn't part of the estimates, but came up as a matter of course over the time that the business of this House was being transacted. And the example I want to give, Mr. Speaker, of course, is that piece of this legislation that deals with the casino contract. Because what this government is engaged in is it is engaged in this bill in bringing forward a piece of legislation that will essentially allow the casino and the casino operator to escape the terms of the bylaw of the regional municipality, which says that they won't be allowed to have their patrons continue to smoke in that facility. And interestingly enough, the Minister of Finance seemed to be overwhelmed by this suggestion. He felt somehow that this would lead to the immediate termination of the operator's contract with respect to the casino, and somehow the government would then lose tens of millions of dollars and perhaps more, and that they weren't prepared to do that. They were going to bring forward this piece of legislation. 25 minutes? 20 minutes? So they were. That was the submission made by the finance minister, and I must say it caught many of us here by considerable surprise, Mr. Speaker, because of course the casino contract, which the minister refers to in this legislation, this year is not the first time that we've seen this contract. we're quite the contrary, Mr. Speaker. The casino contract has been the subject of discussion in this House and in the Public Accounts Committee for a considerable period of time, specifically with respect to the penalties around the building, the original building of the casino, the penalties that weren't levied as a result of what was essentially a backroom deal by the former government with the casino operators. It was designed to at the expense of the taxpayers of this province, confer a considerable benefit on the casino operators. And we undertook a lengthy examination of the casino contract over that period of time. We had many witnesses appear before the Public Accounts Committee, including those that negotiated the terms of this contract, Mr. Speaker. So this wasn't a surprise to anybody here in this House, except apparently the Minister of Finance. And almost immediately after the HRM bylaw came forward, the Minister